This video will be for part 2 of chapter 2, Sex Research and Theory, for PSY 345, Human Sexual Behavior. This part of the chapter is basically just, it seems like it's a requirement in all psychology classes that you take that chapter 2 is about research. We did more of the theoretical perspectives in part 1 of the video. In this part of the video is a very rapid fire review of the research process and some typical techniques that are employed. It's very, very generic. So for those of you who've had, say, a research methods course in psych or in sociology, or if you've taken the data analysis class, some things may sound familiar. Broadly speaking, as in any scientific discipline, the purpose of research is to test hypotheses. We often base our hypotheses on theories. Sometimes we base them on observations of the world around us. Regardless, we tend, as a scientific pursuit, to attempt to collect evidence to either support or refute our hypotheses. The process starts with forming questions. As I said, these can sometimes be prompted by theory. They can also be prompted by observations of what's going on in the world. We then, and this is true regardless of which scientific discipline you're talking about, we review the previous research in that area. We refine and formulate our hypotheses based on the questions that we have formed, and this includes the absolute requirement that you be able to operationalize variables. Some of the theories that I went over in part 1 of this video, like psychoanalytic theory, are chronically hampered by the fact that it's impossible to operationalize, which means measure objectively the concepts and ideas and variables that make up that theory. Many psychological theories, particularly theories in personality, struggle with this operationalization issue. Sexuality research is no exception. If we are proposing ideas, variables that we would like to test in a research context, we have to have ways to objectively measure those variables. The methodology is always, I tend to be a methodologist in my own research, so I tend to focus a great deal on making sure that the methodology is solid and sound, that I've designed a study to collect data that directly, or as directly as possible, tests my hypotheses and measures my variables. Whether you're talking about research done in the private sector or in the public sector, whether it's in an educational context or in a private foundation context, there has to be some kind of ethics review. At the University of Mount Union, for example, we have a human subjects committee that is a part of the institutional review board, and every piece of research that either faculty or students or staff conduct that involves hypothesis testing and involves human participants, we have to get approval from that board stating that the methodologies that we're using have been deemed to be ethical. Then we collect data and we analyze the data. Again, if you took a course like research methods in psychology or the same or analogous courses in sociology, or you took a data analysis class, maybe both, out of the math program, you learn a little bit about how to analyze data. Now, the purpose of data analysis is typically in a couple of different areas. One, to describe what you've got, and that's typically in the form of descriptive statistics, but then also to test hypotheses, and that's where we get into the use of inferential statistics. Then we have to interpret the data, and that interpretation involves saying, okay, based on my research question and my hypotheses, were my hypotheses supported by the findings, or were they not? And then I have to go back to the previous literature and make some decisions about how do my findings inform that previous data collection. If there were previous findings and my data shows something different, what does it add? How does it challenge previous theory? How does it advance the science? And that's really the nature of the scientific community. That community requires or relies really on us sharing our findings, and doing so in a quality controlled environment, for want of a better phrase. We rely on peer reviewed processes for sharing our findings. Although in the internet era, and in an era where we have the ability for just about anybody to post just about anything out into the world, it becomes even more important that we value and use this peer review process to evaluate scientific findings and share them more broadly, to both the academic community but to the world at large. Now, there are some caveats when we're talking specifically about sex research. We have to be very careful, as is the case in all scientific research, but this is a particular problem for sex research. We do have to pay strong attention to bias. People come to research with their own lives, their own values, their own beliefs, their own experiences, and sometimes their own politics and their own agendas. So we have to be very careful to check our own bias. There are biases in terms of people's skills and expertise. There can be bias in the process of science when we're making interpretations. There can be biases in terms of the resources that we use. Bias can then take the form of actually overtly unethical, dishonest, deceptive behaviors. If, for example, you have a researcher who's biased in terms of a political or personal agenda, and they want the findings to look a particular way, they may fudge the data or make data up. And unfortunately, that has happened not just in psychology, but throughout science for as long as there have been scientists. So we have to be very careful, and that's another reason why we rely on the peer review process to evaluate pieces of research and hopefully to clearly ferret out some of these unethical, dishonest practices that could lead to misunderstandings and misinformation. We also have to think about bias in terms of who's being chosen as researchers, who gets funding, who doesn't get funding, what types of projects are approved, but also in who's chosen as participants. You know, like most of psychology, the majority of participants in research on human sexuality have been white and heterosexual, and that's problematic because we're missing the richness and diversity of human sexual behavior. We also have to be very, very mindful that the biases we carry with us, you know, remember that in class the first day when I said, you know, you really have to do an inventory of who you are. Researchers have to do that too, and they often forget, kind of assuming that their perceptions are normative. So really kind of building your research team with diverse voices is extraordinarily important. I pulled this image from your text, just put it in here as a reminder. Look at this, review it, because you're given concrete examples. So what if you don't have a random sample? Frequently in human sexuality research, you're studying it. If you're studying the biology, the physiology of sexual behavior, you're not going to get a random sample. You're going to get volunteers who are very comfortable and likely very experienced sexually. That's not random. That means if that's the sample that you have, and that's what happened with Kinsey, it's what happened with Masters and Johnson especially, you can't generalize those findings easily, because you have an issue there. Even in questionnaire research where you're looking at people's attitudes, if the sample is college students, it's going to be biased in terms of socioeconomic status, race, and ethnicity, and a variety of other intersecting variables. We can't make the assumption that the attitudes and behaviors of college students are going to be representative of the broader culture in which those students are studying. If you don't have a control group in a study that you're conducting. And sometimes it's very hard to find enough participants to do that sort of study, or the topic that you're studying doesn't permit experimental research. That means that you can't make causal conclusions about what you've found. Sometimes it's ethical reasons that prevent you from asking and answering questions in an experimental way. That leaves you with non-experimental techniques, correlational methods, and so on, that you have to be very careful in interpreting. Let's say you found differences between groups, but you don't have an experimental methodology that you're using in order to test those differences. You have to be very careful to make sure that you are not making causal conclusions. Like if you found an age difference, that may not be because of aging. It may be because of the environment, the culture has changed and influenced those groups differently. So it may not be an age difference at all. It may in fact be a cultural transformation. If you don't have terms that are carefully operationally designed or defined rather, any findings that you get are functionally uninterpretable. So if your methods were problematic, if your definitions were problematic, you are not going to have findings that you can interpret. So your authors give you examples like hooking up, sexual satisfaction. You need to carefully, and each of us has an internal, like when I say the phrase hooking up, you have your own personal definition of what that means. Is that a definition that is going to capture what is out there in the real world of behavior? So what you do as a good researcher, you go back to the literature, look at how other people have defined that construct. If the definitions that are becoming the most normative in the world of researchers is appropriate, you keep that definition so that the other researchers who are studying this area have an agreed upon set of ways of measuring and defining the variable. If you have a problem with the definition, then the topic of study actually becomes the definitions. So using different terminologies, using additional explanations and instructions to participants can help to clarify some of those issues. If bias is present, that can lead to misinformation and slants in terms of how conclusions are being drawn. The example your researchers give is sex toy use research. If the funder is an organization that makes sex toys, then you have to ask questions about bias. Similarly, if you're talking about, say, a new medication that's supposed to treat loss of sexual desire, if all of the funding for that research comes from the drug maker and they already have a drug in the pipeline, then you have to really kind of raise your eyebrow and say, I need independent research that is not funded by the drug maker to show efficacy. And you can read the remaining caveats here, and it's important that your authors have given you concrete examples so that you understand what they mean. Now, I mentioned earlier ethics in research. Any researcher doing work in either the private or the public sector or in educational contexts is going to have to subject their project and its proposal parameters to some sort of oversight body so that it can be checked in terms of ethical process. One of the really key issues in sexuality research, as in research in general, if you're doing work with human subjects, is the concept of informed consent. Now, I'm guessing that you have signed consent forms in your life, and I'm also guessing, because we're all this way, that you didn't read it. And that's unfortunate. We should all spend more time reading consent forms that are presented to us so that we understand the decision that we're making, and we're doing so mindfully. Informed consent became something that is normative to be granted to research participants following a wide range of ethically challenged is a soft term. A series of experiments, and these are just heavily selected examples, like the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where people were not told that they were intentionally being infected and then not treated for syphilis. There was syphilis and gonorrhea research in Guatemala. There were also other kinds of studies, like the participant observer study that comes more out of sociology, anthropology on the tea room trade, where people were going in incognito and observing male sexual interactions that were homosexual at a time when that behavior was illegal in that place. And there was no informed consent, and it represented a real danger to those people, not just the danger of being outed, but the danger of being arrested and charged with sex offenses. So informed consent is critical, so that people can make mindful decisions about whether or not they choose to participate. I mentioned before that institutions like Mount Union have an institutional review board, and these boards are filled with people who not only have research experience, but also people who don't. For instance, our review board has some social scientists on it, people like Dr. Muller and Dr. Turco, but also, we have people from the biological and biological sciences, chemistry, and so on. But there's also people from religion and philosophy. These are in part faculty members, but we are also required to have someone from the community. Sometimes that's a person who's a member of the clergy. On our animal use board for animal research, it requires the presence of a veterinarian on that board. So the idea is that based on the Belmont report and its later iterations, we have to demonstrate that we are showing in our research that we are protecting people, that we are showing respect for persons, that the research we're doing is valuable on its face in such a way that the benefits of the research outweigh the risks of it, and that there is a principle of justice being applied. In other words, that we are fairly and appropriately selecting subjects, that we are not coercing people into being participants, and that the fruits, the benefits of the work are going to be equitably shared. Now, there are lots of different methods of data collection. I've mentioned experimental research previously. For some of you, you have experience in research methods from courses that you've taken. For others, you've never studied research methods outside of maybe your science courses in middle school and high school. If that's the case, if that's your only experience, you were probably kind of given this hybrid introduction to scientific research that didn't really clearly distinguish between experimental research and non-experimental research. So experimental research is like doing a true experiment, where you are manipulating one variable in order to determine how it affects some dependent variable of interest. Like, for example, exposing one group of participants to pornographic imagery that includes violence, a second group that involves pornographic imagery that doesn't have violence, and a third group that watches non-pornographic but sexy material, and maybe a pure control group that watches some documentary on the Weather Channel. Who knows? But what you're doing is systematically varying program content. Like, is it porn with violence? Is it just porn with no violence? Is it just erotic? Or is it neutral? And then looking at some dependent variable of interest. Maybe it's level of sexual arousal. Maybe it's attitudes towards committing sexual assaults or sexual violence or harassment, whatever that is that you're interested in. Then there are non-experimental techniques. Now, your authors really kind of narrow their focus here. There are a lot of non-experimental techniques. Probably the most common that's used not just in psychology in general, but also in sexuality research, is survey type research, where you're asking people about their attitudes, beliefs, values, and behaviors. Interviews are one approach you can for doing this, but you can also use questionnaires. And again, you have personal experience with filling out questionnaires of all different shapes and sizes. I am, one of my major tools in my research is questionnaire research, and it can be very useful, but you have to be very tactical in the way you design questionnaires so that you get the data you actually want. Some other research, and certainly in the history of sexuality research, we've seen quite a bit of this, especially since we are very eclectic, looking at a very eclectic body of researchers coming not just from psychology, but also from sociology and anthropology. In field research, you're going into the world with all of its messy variability and observing and studying behavior in its natural context. Sometimes this is participant observation, where you have a researcher who participates in what's being studied. I remember when I was in graduate school reading some research that was participant observation research by a graduate student who was studying the culture of gay nightclubs. Now, the researcher was himself a homosexual man, well acquainted with kind of the culture in his particular region, and he designed a study where there were particular variables that were of interest, and it was kind of one of these studies that was trying to just get a handle on what's there, what kind of variables are in play, and what kind of patterns of behavior might be interesting to study further. Now, there's also non-participant observation, and here investigators are doing observations, but they're not active participants in a group. So in this case, you have people who are watching, observing, usually without the people who are being watched and observed being aware that they are being studied. Participant observation studies vary in terms of whether the person who is the participant is candid about their research or whether they are not. And that raises a number of ethical questions and concerns. So what the researcher would have to do, if they're going to be incognito, if you will, undercover, then the IRB would need to have very, very clearly spelled out ethical protections for the privacy of the individuals being observed, and respect for that privacy is absolutely paramount. You also have to have ethical guarantees that the participant observer or the non-participant observer is not going to behave in any way that puts any of the participants at risk of psychological, physical, or social consequences for the research that's being done. There are also laboratory observations. These are sometimes in-lab studies where you're taking physiological measurements. Sometimes direct laboratory observation is a part of an experimental design, like the Masters and Johnson work and some of the Kinsey work. But sometimes it's merely observational, where you're trying to just get a handle on how does the anatomy work or how does the physiology work. There are also case studies. Case studies are frequently clinical in nature, where you're doing in-depth work on an interesting case or series of cases that have a particular quality. This is more of a narrowed kind of interview approach, but it can also be an approach where you're attempting to validate the utility of a particular treatment approach, for example. Now, there are levels of analysis in research, and what that means is when we set out to design a piece of research, we have a question. There are three basic kinds of research questions. Some research questions are simply to describe what's there. Like, how often does this particular behavior happen in the community? How often is this attitude or belief expressed in the community of interest? That's description. The second type of question is correlational, and separate that word from the statistical technique of the correlation. Correlational questions ask about relationships between variables. So whereas in descriptive questions you're just asking what's there, how much, how often, in correlation you're saying how strongly and in what way are my variables of interest connected to one another. When researchers talk about variables being connected, they mean, can I use one variable to predict the other and vice versa? And then the third level is a research question where you're really trying to determine cause and effect. And cause and effect, the bar is very high. In psychology, causal research that leads to causal explanations is like the Holy Grail. It's really hard to do, primarily because human beings, and I say this all the time in my methods classes, human beings are annoyingly complex, which means that our behaviors, and sexual behavior is no exception, our behaviors are multiply caused. There are multiple causal pathways that intersect and influence one another on the way to leading to some outcome behavior of interest. So that is very challenging for us. It's also challenging because the only methodology that can get you to a causal explanation is the experimental method. And sometimes it's just ethically inappropriate or impossible to do experimental research on behaviors that we are truly interested in understanding. So, for example, if we want to know, causally speaking, the impact of child sexual abuse, the experiment, the true experiment, would involve randomly assigning newborns to families and then engineering some of them to be abused and others not. Obviously, that's like a bad science fiction movie. We can't do that. It's unethical, it's immoral, it's illegal, it's utterly and completely inappropriate. Therefore, we have to use carefully designed correlational methods and carefully designed descriptive methods to help us understand the complicated interrelationships between variables that predict outcomes that we're interested in. When we're interpreting data, it's very important as we move through this class across the semester and as we talk in class, I will share with you, research findings that I'm aware of. Your challenge is always going to be, how do I interpret those findings and how do I talk about them? The same goes for researchers. The hardest part of research isn't the doing it, it's the making sense of the findings that is often challenging. So we have to, the norms in our culture as researchers, we have to be very circumspect about our findings. We qualify the results. We can only take our findings where the methodology justifies taking them. If you're doing correlational research, you cannot make causal statements about the data. If you're only doing descriptive work, you cannot make statements about correlations among the variables. You can speculate, you can create new hypotheses, but you can't make hard and fast statements like this causes that when the only data you have is correlational. So what we're doing when we report our findings, we qualify the results, we criticize our own methodologies, we expose the limitations for our audience to see. And then we carefully draw inferences from the results. We try to weave our findings into the previous research so it makes sense in a theoretical context. And we discuss possible ways in which the findings might matter in the real world. Because one of the things that we have to do when we go before an IRB board to justify our work is to say, are the benefits of this work, do they outweigh the risks to my participants? And we have to think about that. Are there positive results that can come from this research that have a meaningful impact on the wider culture? And that's particularly true for sex research. I mentioned before, we have to identify the limitations of our work. When we're talking about things we would really like to have causal explanations of, it's so tempting as a researcher to dabble in that description. But if we are limited ethically and practically to correlational methods, we have to carefully lay out for our readers, for our audiences, the fact that we cannot make those kinds of conclusions. We also, in our interpretations and discussions, are required to think about what's the next step, what are the unanswered questions, what are the things that need to continue to be studied. So maybe you study in one population, there are other questions that need to, or your findings need to be verified or tested with other populations in other contexts in order for us to have a firmer understanding of the nature of the variables. So that concludes part 2 of our look at chapter 2 on sex research and theory.